Hello, everyone. My name is Richard Brethour-Bell. I am the president and CEO of the Black Pride Network. I'm also the host of the Black Pride Network presentation of Perspectives, the podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about cultural humility and cultural competency. We're going to talk about what the difference is and why it's important that we all invest in cultural competency and cultural humility. Here's what we'll cover today. We'll define cultural competence and cultural humility and give examples of these concepts in action. We'll set personal goals for moving from cultural competence to cultural humility. Develop a common understanding of the principles of cultural humility and cultural competence. Practice using the principles in our organizational and community activities. And finally, we'll grow in knowledge and understanding of the different cultures. We'll define culture. It is our shared systems of values and beliefs, world lens, our behavior, how we see the world, the things that define us individually as well as a group. That is what we think of when we think of culture. Here are some examples of cultural groups: religious, ethnic, age, gender and sexual orientation, educational, professional, geographic, formed by social circumstances. These are examples of what makes up a cultural group. So what does it mean to be culturally competent? Culturally competent means to communicate with and effectively interact with people across cultures. It means being aware of one's own worldview. This is where you start. In order to have a better understanding of different cultures, you need to have a pronounced understanding of your own culture, your own belief systems, your history. So it's about developing positive attitudes toward cultural differences. You may have to rid yourself of previously bad attitudes and replace it with positive attitudes of different cultures. Gaining knowledge of different cultural practices and worldviews, developing skills for communication and interaction across cultures. When you have an understanding of what motivates people, what part of their culture motivates their behavior, then it puts you in a better position to understand and relate to different individuals. What is cultural humility? Cultural humility is a lifelong commitment to self-evaluation and self-critique. So what do we mean by that? So it's not just about a one and done. For example, in the state of New Mexico, you have a great deal of Native Americans who are very proud of their heritage, and they may have a feast. If you are an individual who goes to this feast, you may think, okay, this is me learning about cultures. That is one aspect of your learning. That is cultural competence, taking an interest in learning about other cultures. But cultural humility is a lifelong journey. It is an investment in a continuation of learning about different cultures. Recognition of power dynamics and imbalances and a desire to fix those power imbalances and to develop partnerships with people and groups who advocate for others. Institutional accountability. So whether we're talking about a corporation or a nonprofit organization, cultural humility and institutional accountability means that the organization is also invested in a continuing education of learning about different cultures. Becoming culturally competent and practicing cultural humility. So these are some of the words from Nicole A. Cook, librarian, incredibly successful individual. One of the things she says is that each community is distinct and has its own needs. There are also communities within communities, all of which deserve recognition and special attention. Let me give you an example of a community within a community. My day job is working for Department of Corrections in New Mexico. So I go into the prisons and provide workshops to both staff as well as the inmates on everything from opioid overdose prevention, alcohol use disorder, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion training. That is an example of a culture within a culture, or cultures within a culture. So you have the culture of incarceration. Within that culture, you have people from different races, different ethnicities, different religious backgrounds. Within that culture, you have a separation of staff members and a separation of inmates. So this is an example of a culture within a culture. Ms. Cook goes on to say that not only recognize power dynamics and imbalances, but to redress these imbalances. It is one thing to say that we live in a patriarchal society. We recognize that. It's another thing to say that as those of us who identify as males, that we're going to use that privilege to bring about equity when it comes to male and female dynamics and imbalances. So redressing those imbalances means doing the work, not just addressing them, not just acknowledging them, but actually being invested to do the work to bring about significant change. So here's a little breakdown of the difference between cultural competence and cultural humility. So cultural competence is gaining cultural knowledge. This is the beginning steps of the education process about learning about other cultures. Developing cultural self-awareness. You cannot truly be invested in learning about other cultures until you start with your own. You need to know the history about your own culture. How do you relate to that today? Do you feel as connected to your culture as perhaps your ancestors did? Those are questions that we need to start with in our endeavor to become more cultural competent. Cultural humility, holding systems accountable. We talked about institutional accountability previously. And what we mean by that is recognizing there are some imbalances here. There are some things that need to be addressed, some issues that must be addressed. We need to do that as an organization in order to bring about systemic change. Understanding and redressing power imbalances means putting forth the effort to bring about the changes that we recognize, the power imbalances that we've learned about, that we recognize. Maybe this was brought to our attention by employees, by membership. That's a possibility, but we really need to be invested to make sure that we change these power imbalances, that we bring about equity. So that's why it's really important to be invested in cultural humility. And while when it comes to cultural competence, that might be taking a class, that might be taking several classes to become more aware. Cultural humility is a lifelong investment. As long as you're living, as long as you're breathing, you never stop learning. And that is what cultural humility is about. So cultural competence and cultural humility both require the developing of cultural self-awareness, becoming aware of your own cultural norms, attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. This is important because a lot of things in our cultures that we don't perceive as negative initially gets passed down from generation to generation. And you may feel like, oh, that's just where it comes from. That's just the way my people are. That's just part of our culture. Well, if that culture contributes to power dynamics, if it contributes to oppression and marginalization of other cultures, then it is a negative, even if it's something that's been passed down for generation to generation. That is where you need to start to make sure that you don't develop these ideas or continue to perpetuate these negative ideas. Identifying and examining your own personal bias and stereotypes and prejudice. First, understanding that we all have them. We all have biases. How can we live in a world that is so divided with so many wars and so many differences in cultures that cause negativity and not think that we don't have biases ourselves, that we don't have prejudices ourselves? Of course, we all do. Recognizing that is the first step to a positive change, to a systemic change. Consider the impact cultural differences might have on your interactions with BIPOC. And remember, BIPOC would be Black, Indigenous, people, or persons of color, and their families and their communities. So recognizing this will prevent you from continually doing more harm than good. Both cultural competence and cultural humility require gaining cultural knowledge. This means really learning about the lived experiences of cultures that differ from your own. Lived experience is more than just textbook. It is having a better understanding how different cultures navigate through the world. And you only get that lived experience from firsthand knowledge. Reading in textbooks and reading in history books is one aspect of it, but oftentimes those are interpretations by someone who may not necessarily be part of that culture that you're trying to learn about. But lived experience coming from individuals who are part of the culture that you're trying to learn about is extremely valuable. It's the day-to-day lives of operation, the challenges, the experiences that individuals from that particular culture have. It's extremely important. Attend cultural events and festivals. I mentioned earlier about the different feasts that some Native communities have. That's a great way about learning to learn about different cultures. Establish trusting relationships with community confidants or connectors who are able to provide insights into cultural norms, family practices, communication styles, traditions, etc., and community visits. So if you are someone who enjoys going to different prides year after year, have you ever attended a Black pride? Have you ever attended a Latino pride? If you haven't, this is a great way to develop an understanding and knowledge and information about Black queer communities or BIPOC communities, BIPOC queer communities. And it's important that we learn about these things because we face challenges when we sit upon these boards, when boards become more diverse, and we haven't taken the time to learn about the different cultures. What is insulting to some? What is perceived as a negative? These are things that we have to take into consideration, and we only learn about this by becoming more involved and more educated about the different cultures. So this is a self-assessment tool. There's a link to that. I would encourage you to take this self-assessment tool. This is a better way for you to understand where you are, what interests you, what biases that you may have. Um, please take the time to take this self-evaluation. It's not for anyone else to see, but for you. This is for you to have a better understanding of where you fit in when it comes to cultural competence. I also want to encourage people to take the Harvard implicit bias test. You can Google that. And that also gives you an understanding of where you are and some challenges that you may need to bring to your own attention to be aware of some of the things that have to be addressed. We all have biases and all have prejudices, and these checklists, the self-assessment tool for cultural competence, as well as the Harvard implicit bias test, is going to point that out. It is not for you to feel bad about yourself. It is to give you some place to start in your development of cultural competence and your journey of cultural humility. So here is the growth model. These are some of the steps that we need to go through in order to develop our cultural competency and continue to evolve in our cultural humility. The panic zone, where disbelief lives and fear stops all action. This is where you might hear a person say, hey, listen, I'm not a racist. Some of my best friends are Black or brown. It's immediately defense. They're on the defense because they feel like they're being attacked. And this is an opportunity to learn. Am I prejudiced in some areas? Do I have some biases? Is there something about my behavior that might indicate to others that there is some kind of bias there? Those are the things we take into consideration. So the panic zone is where a lot of people start. The stretch zone, where excitement lives, action takes place, and fear disappears. So this might be attending BIPOC prides. This might be attending feasts, developing relationships and commonality with cultures that differ from yours. That's going to help you to relax a little bit more. For those of us a little older, we probably remember the Seinfeld episode where they didn't have any Black friends. And they noticed this and decided they wanted to be invested in finding Black friends. Unfortunately, that only seemed to last one episode. But that's where cultural humility comes into play, where it becomes a lifelong journey. Once we have invested in learning about different cultures and building relationships from there, then that puts us in a stretch zone. We're less panicked. We're more comfortable being around cultures that differ from ours. The comfort zone, where fear lives, action is limited or sporadic, and excitement wanes. So if we get too comfortable, when we're not getting to the point where we're having a better understanding of cultural humility, where we invested in a long time, effort in education process, then we can revert back to the panic zone. Why? Because we got too comfortable. It became too easy, we became too relaxed that we didn't think about what we were doing anymore. We didn't think about the education process anymore. It became less about learning about other people and more about how much we have grown and how much we have educated ourselves. Something I like to keep in mind is that the smartest people in the world never feel like they learn enough. They have a thirst for knowledge. They want more information. That's how we should be. Not that we ever get to the point where we know enough. We don't need to discuss anything else. I don't need to learn anything else. That kind of arrogance lacks humility. And it is a requirement to have humility to grow, to become more educated. You have to be comfortable with what you don't know. That requires humility in order for you to be educated. So again, cultural humility is about understanding and redressing power imbalances, studying the history of race and racism in the US and understanding how it disproportionately impacts BIPOC. Keep in mind, a significant amount of the textbooks that we encounter as youth did very little to talk about the civil rights movement in the United States, about other movements as well, Native American, Latino movement, the Asian quest for equality and equity. So it's important that we do our homework because our textbooks in school left a lot out. Completing racial equity training. Everyone should be taking an equity class. What you might do is find out what your privilege is. You know, I am a Black man. I am a gay man. As a man, I have some privilege in a patriarchal society. One of the examples is that I rarely feel threatened when I'm walking to my car at night, when I'm alone on a sidewalk. I don't necessarily feel threatened by that. And a lot of that has to do with being male. And when it comes to those who are preying on people, they prey on the weak. I'm not a big man. I am a fit man, and I feel more comfortable in defending myself if it comes to that. That is part of being a privilege, the privilege of being male. So recognize what your privilege is, and we all have some privilege as well. And that would help us with our racial equity training. Learning to develop and evaluate culturally relevant and appropriate programs, materials, and interventions. It may be upon you for your community, for your organization, for your place of work to come up with ways that we can be more culturally aware. That responsibility may fall on you, and don't be afraid of it. This is a way that we grow as an organization, as a community. This is how we redress power imbalances, by first recognizing that they exist and then being invested to do something about it, to bring about systemic change. And why humility? Again, it goes back to being modest. It goes back to being humble. This is what's needed to grow. You have to be comfortable with what you don't know in order to learn, in order to be educated, in order to evolve. You need to show patience. There needs to be gentleness when it comes to helping other people to grow as well. Some people are not going to get it the first time out. If you're talking about someone who's enjoyed a great deal of privilege their whole lives, remember their privilege is no fault of their own. the responsibility in order to correct systemic issues falls upon all of us. So because of an individual's privilege and the amount of privilege they have, it may take them a little longer to understand the importance of humility. And we need to give them that grace in order to do that. So being humble means we're not arrogant, we're not prideful, we're aware. Um, we're aware of what we don't know. We're aware of the importance to constantly gain knowledge and be compassionate and offer grace to those who are probably taking a little longer to get there. So we talked about institutional accountability before. What we mean by that is the acknowledgement and assumption of responsibilities for actions, products, decisions, policies, including the administration, governance, and implementation within the institution. This is extremely important. I want to give you an example. Years ago, H&M, the clothing brand, had a campaign where they put a beautiful dark-skinned black boy in a sweater called Coolest Monkey in the Jungle. So a great deal of people were offended by it. I was offended as well. H&M recognized that this did offend people, even though they're saying initially that wasn't their intent. It was to celebrate our differences, but it was a clear indication that there's diversity in this marketing scheme. Otherwise, someone should have been able to recognize how offensive that was. But what they did was take accountability. Said, you know what, we messed up. Let us add some more diverse talent when it comes to our marketing, and hopefully we won't make this mistake again. That is the first step in institutional accountability, recognizing that, hey, some things need to change. We need to do better. I give workshops for DEI for different organizations, diversity, equity, inclusion, corporate organizations, as well as nonprofits. And one of the things I tell people to do with their developing their organization culture is look around in different departments. Is it diverse? Do we see more of one group than we do another? If that is the case, that doesn't necessarily mean that there was bias, but it means it's something that you should give your attention to. It's something you should investigate to see if that is the case. And so you can bring about a significant change or systemic change rather. So it's extremely important to look within, to do the work, to first recognize areas that might need to be addressed, and then do the work to bring about those changes. That is what we mean about institutional accountability. Institutions and cultural humility. It requires being humble and courageous self-reflection. That means don't be afraid that you're going to find some biases, some prejudices that you have, because if you really did do the homework, you will, because we all do. Dialogue with the community and hear their input as expert, meaning when we're talking about that lived experience, this isn't something to be questioned. If a person says, this is my experience, we don't question that. We don't ask them, how do you know that's what happened? How do you know? They're giving you their perspective based on their experience. That should be accepted. You don't necessarily have to agree. It's not a requirement that you agree with someone's lived experience, but we're talking about accepting it as part of cultural humility. Work with the power imbalance by distributing the knowledge and decision-making often and freely. What I do with some of my workshops, I'll say that if you are a man and you enjoy a great deal of privilege, why not use that privilege to help others? Turn around to see perhaps a woman who rarely speak up in some of these meetings and ask her, Jane, what are your thoughts on this? Or a person of color who never seems to get a chance to speak. Ask that person, John, what did you think about this? Use your privilege to lift people up. That is part of cultural humility, particularly as it relates to institutions. Create communities of dialogue to work with community members and clients and each other on tough issues. Don't be afraid of tough issues. Don't run from it. I had a friend of mine tell me that he's a white man who enjoys a great deal of privilege, that he does not like talking about race because it makes him uncomfortable. You cannot grow and evolve if you don't first live and what is uncomfortable. There's just no way. If you're never uncomfortable, you're not growing, you're not evolving. You need to be uncomfortable with what you don't know, what you have experienced, your transgressions, your lack of education is something. It is required in order for you to grow. So don't be afraid of being uncomfortable when you're doing that humble and courageous self-reflection. When you are taking institutional accountability, you're going to stop the particular culture, social, and political practice that reinforce discrimination in inaccessibility. Let me do that again. Part of institutional accountability is the particular cultural, social, and political practices that reinforce discrimination and inaccessibility. So we want to recognize what groups, what individuals, what cultures can traditionally not have access, haven't had a seat at the table, and make sure we work to change that behavior. We want to expedite trust and relationship building that powerfully influences with individuals and identify communities historically absent from the table. So we want to make sure that we acknowledge, hey, here is a group that hasn't always been here. What can we do to be more inclusive? So those are the institutions and cultural humility, the institutional accountability that we need to address. Dialogue versus discussion. It wasn't until I got to grad school that I understood the difference or learned about the difference between discussion and dialogue. I didn't know there was a difference. So this was very enlightening for me. Here's what discussion is. It is to fix, to advocate a single perspective, to present a position as right, to sell, persuade, enlist, to succumb to one strong opinion, to prove one's own vision. When I think of discussion, I think of a jury. As a jury is deliberating, they're trying to come to one singular conclusion. There may be people who have a different perspective and don't see things the same way as others are seeing them. Well, the goal is to get everyone on the same page. That is discussion. Jury deliberation is a prime example of that. Next. And we counter that with dialogue. Dialogue is to learn, to hear and understand different perspectives, to offer, reflect, and inquire, to explore collective thinking and meaning, to allow for common ground, to discover, create shared visions, to seek coherence between thought and action. Dialogue does not necessarily require a decision be made immediately. This is more of a learning process, more of a developing process. It differs from jury deliberation, where we have to get to one answer. Dialogue is about growth. It's about the educational process. That's something to keep in mind. So George Miller was a professor of psychology at Princeton, and he said something that really stuck with me. Listen at this as if the speaker is wise. This is how we get the greatest value of lived experience, not by questioning what the person is saying, but believing them as if what they say is a source of wisdom, and take that into consideration. You don't have to agree with everything someone says, but we could give that person that space and the grace to say how they feel, to talk about their experiences without necessarily being judged by it. He went on to say, to understand what another person is saying, you must assume that it is true and try to imagine what it could be true of. That is a challenge, I think, for all of us. That sometimes someone is saying something that we feel like, okay, this is just not accurate. It just can't be. It's not possible. But Miller's law is that we are to understand another person, what another person is saying. In order to do so, we must assume that what they're saying is true. True to them. You don't have to debate it. For that individual, it is true. It is gospel. If we can recognize that, that would go a long way in bridging the divide of communication. So keep in mind when we're learning about lived experiences that we are accepting that what that person is saying is the gospel truth, at least to them. Culture humility application. Know your own identity and what you are bringing to an interaction. Learn about your culture, your belief system, what contributed to that, your religion, your familial history, your cultural history. And what ways are you bringing your identity, power, and privilege to the table? You've had to first recognize those things. Um, recognize what is your makeup. You are to be self-defining. It's not what other people define you as. It's about how you see yourself, how you navigate through society. What are the contributing factors that is the makeup of who you are? Your identity, your power, your privilege. That is what we bring into the table when it comes to um, culture of humility. Can you listen and respectfully inquire in order to determine how best to foster effective communication? It's extremely important to stop and listen first. People are talking, they're sharing with you. If you are thinking in your mind the next thing that you want to say, the point that you're trying to bring about, it's not active listening, and you're not going to foster effective communication that way. So it's important to listen. And then when you have the opportunity, respectfully ask questions. Humility is not a laundry list of cultural traits to check off. So I've been to a Black Pride. I've been to a feast. No, no one needs to hear your laundry list because that's part of your journey to get to cultural humility. You were invested in cultural competence, and that cultural competence puts you on the journey to your cultural humility. That doesn't require a laundry list. Cultural humility, remember, is a lifelong journey. There is no point of having a laundry list when it comes to that. Choose to be a servant leader, choose humility. Some of the most effective leaders lead from a position of service. One example you want to think about is Martin Luther King Jr. This is someone who constantly questioned, should he be the one to take the lead in certain movements and certain protest? That is what we mean about being a servant leader. How can I best serve the community that I am trying to be involved with? Prime example of what a leader is. Culture humility application, remember the importance of community advocacy. Community is central to the work, and we advocate in partnership. Important to listen and creating the conditions for a community voice. These are all aspects of cultural humility. So here is one of my favorite illustration. Uh, we live in a society where people often talk about the importance of equality, but leave out equity. And it is impossible to get true equality without equity. So equality is sameness, giving everyone the same thing. We're all starting from the same place. It's important. But when we're talking about a society, a community, um, where people have not always had the same access, you cannot start with equality. We have to deal with equity, and equity is fairness. Access to the same opportunities, we must invest in uh, the needed tools in order to get to that equality. So you see the top illustration. Everyone has the same, but we can immediately see how there are uh, obstacles in a way. You give someone who is disabled a bike. They have a bike just like an able-bodied person, but that isn't equity. You have an individual who's very tall for their bike. Doesn't really work for them, and a person where the bike is too big for them, but they're all the same bikes, right? That is equality, and that is good. We all deserve the same. But in order to get there, we need equity. We need the tools that will put us in a place to have access. That is what equity is. So we have a bike for a person who has a disability. We have a bike the right size for a tall person and a bike the right size for a very small person. That is what we mean about equity, providing individuals the tools that they need in order to have access. Another example of it, um, I love this, that it's not just to tell a different story, but change the story altogether. The reality is that we have power imbalances. We have a lack of access for a significant amount of people. Equality is giving everyone the same thing, but as you see, providing everyone the same does not provide access. Equity is giving people the tools that they need in order to have access. And then liberation and justice is when the barrier to access is removed altogether, when we don't need tools for those access because the barrier there is removed. That is true liberation. That is true justice. That is what equality and equity should get to. It should get to liberation. It should get to justice. So I want to thank you for taking the time to log in and be part of this podcast. The Perspectives podcast, which is brought to you by BPN, that is the Black Pride Network, is about providing education. It's about providing awareness. So thank you for taking the time to participate with us.